let's go ahead and get this kicked off. As I said, my name is Allison Pryor. I am a Senior Security Specialist Solutions Architect at AWS. I actually work within our worldwide specialist organization's prototyping team, helping customers discover the art of the possible. A little bit about myself. I've been with AWS about 2 years now, just over 2 years now. As far as this presentation goes, I've spent over 5 years helping DevOps teams prior to coming to AWS implement security practices inside of their pipelines, and I also owned, managed, maintained, and operated cloud transformation and cloud migration for all aspects of security into AWS. I'm married, have 4 beautiful daughters, and have 1 cat and now 7 chickens as of earlier this week. So to kick off, a little while ago, I was reading a book to help me manage teenagers and their fun nature. And it's the book's called The Anatomy of Peace by the Harbinger Institute. If you haven't read it, it's a beautiful book. You should go read it. And what it talks about is this program in Arizona for troubled teens. And as a part of this program, they actually require the parents to attend a 2-day course where they talk to the parents about how they impact their child's daily lives and how, as parents, they have a decision to make in how they choose to act or react with regards to their children. And the person talking to the parents drew a triangle similar to this and drew a line. And he talked about how that for most parents dealing with troubled teens, that they spend the vast majority of their time dealing with all the things that are going wrong or reacting to the choices of their teenager, which leaves them very little time to actually help things go right and therefore prevent negative things from happening. And as I read this book, it dawned on me that this is actually the daily life of security services and practices. And if you're in security or dev or ops and you have to deal with daily reminders that you have security things to do, such as patching, updates, technical debt, these are all things that you spend way more time in trying to implement, and as a security professional, I keep badgering you to implement. And you get into this concept of the technical debt spiral because you spend way more time, and I spend way more time, dealing with all the things that are going wrong that I don't really get to help you with things that are going right or help you to go right, and therefore avoid all the things that are going wrong. So in traditional development practices, what are some of those things that really contribute to things that go wrong? Well, you may actually have developers that don't actually deploy their code or deploy their code into production environments. So they have to ask their infrastructure team, hey, I need new servers. And they have to wait 6, 12, 18 weeks to get their infrastructure. But they don't get to deploy that code into production. They have to pass it over the wall to your operations teams. And who knows how long that takes. In the company I was working at, 6 weeks. Didn't matter how big, how little that change was, even if it was 1 line of code, 6 weeks. That's how long you had to wait, because that's how backed up the ops teams were in deploying that code into production. And because every environment was a snowflake environment, every environment from dev to test to QA to production was configured differently. So from a security perspective, each environment had to be configured, and therefore you didn't have any standardization across not only ops and development configurations, but also in the protection of that environment because everything was unique. In addition to that, when something went wrong, because it was never a matter of if it went wrong, because it always goes wrong, the ops people didn't know how the application worked because they didn't develop it, but the developers don't have access to production because they didn't deploy it. And so then you get into this constant over-the-shoulder, half the information, half the time situation that leads to Band-Aid fixes. And because the developers can't actually get the data out of production and they can't deploy the fix to production, then the ops team has to do that deployment, and you reinforce this idea that every environment is completely different. In addition to that, you have tooling, because every single team deploys differently, because every single team has to do what they do in the way that they do it. And so your ops teams not only have to support the entire organization, but now they have to support 15, 20 different languages and 30 different tools that the dev teams are now saying, this is how we do it and this is what you're going to do. And that makes it very difficult for people to transition from team to team, as well as standardizing your organizational environment, which again leads to the technical debt spiral. Your teams can't actually get ahead in their features because they continually spend more and more time dealing with all the things that went wrong or are going wrong, and have less and less time to actually fix and provide new features, which ultimately drives better customer value. When it comes to DevOps itself, what teams have found is that by doing DevOps, continuous integration, or continuous development, deployment frequency dramatically reduces from weeks to months. In my case, 6 weeks, went down to hours, and for some applications, minutes, to deploy a change not just in one environment, but in all of the environments. In addition to that, the time it takes for a change to go into production can drop from 1 to 6 months down to 1 to 7 days, or even less. In the case of Log4j recently, we were able to manage an entire code repository which housed several hundred projects in less than 4 hours. They were all updated. In addition to that, the rate at which changes going into production actually fell can be dramatically reduced, anywhere from 40 to 60% previously to 0 to 15%. We have some customers that haven't had a failure in deployment to production in years. In addition to that, teams find that their change is 3 times more effective, their change management process. 70% of the teams that are doing DevOps practices can restore their service in less than a day. And the same goes for recuperating from a security vulnerability. And teams that are running DevOps practices actually enjoy their job more than the previous process. Now, in all those statistics, with the exception of recovering from a vulnerability, we haven't really talked about security. And security as a part of the DevOps process is something that has been talked about from a DevSecOps process. But what's the impact of security on the DevOps process? If you are not aware, Google does a State of the DevOps report every single year. It's a great publication. If you haven't read it, go read it. In 2022, they actually studied this question of what does security actually do in the DevOps process? And at the end of the section, they have a section of surprises that they found after they went through the research. And they found that security practices were actually the mechanism through which technical capabilities impacting software delivery performance and organizational performance. It was the security that was making these positive changes in the DevOps processes. Now, in my own experience, I believe and have experienced that security, when done right, enables the business to deliver customer value quicker, with a higher quality and a lower risk, by empowering the developers to own their entire development lifecycle. Now, DevSecOps can be really summarized in 4 buckets: accountability, automation, awareness, and autonomy. By building it, you own it mentality of DevOps, you ensure that there's no more throwing it over the wall. There's no more, hey, you did something wrong, because you're the one that did everything. In addition to that, that allows your team to build automation to speed up that delivery, reduce the time frames and the wait for your infrastructure, for your deployments through your environments, and the validations to ensure that it passes all of those checks and balances. In addition to that, you now have the awareness, because you own every aspect of your infrastructure, from your compute, networking, storage, all the way up to the applications. You can tell and get the monitoring and logging necessary to not understand what the current state is, but to potentially start to build indicators of instability or in the security space, indicators of compromise. Ultimately, it gives you the capacity to have autonomy. Autonomy from the rigid practices of other groups and waiting on those groups to execute those processes. In the case of the company that I worked with, by integrating the security practices, by giving and empowering the developers, not only did they go from 6+ weeks of development and deployment down to hours, the security review for them to actually be allowed to go to production went from 3 weeks to 15 minutes. It went from arduous Excel spreadsheets and delivering evidence through emails to a single pane view of 4 check marks. And as long as they were green, you got a good thumbs up and you got to go to production. Because we knew that the developers were doing what they were supposed to do as they went through their process of deploying through the DevSecOps process. What are the tenets of DevSecOps? First and foremost, test early. The earlier you can test for security issues, the sooner they're identified and the sooner they're fixed. Now, one of the things that I found in trying to work and collaborate with my dev teams is that whenever I tried to talk to them about security, they kind of glazed over and went to sleep and told me, we don't have time for security. When I started talking to them about, hey, your code's kind of ugly, well, they got really upset. And they're like, what do you mean my code's ugly? I do a good job. I build good code. And I'm like, you do, but it can be better. And let me show you, because fundamentally, security is nothing more than quality. When you do the right thing in coding practices, you're actually embedding security into your product. And if you look at any security vulnerability that can be compromised, whether you're talking OWASP top 10, CVEs, back-end processes, it all comes down to doing the right thing at the right time during your development process. And by giving the developers tools to identify where they can improve the quality of their code, they ultimately deliver a better product faster with less involvement with security, which makes everybody happy, including security. So by testing early, what I'm saying is give the people the tools to do it themselves. Security shouldn't be this isolated environment or this isolated team with their own tools. It should be as open source and openly accessible as possible. What then enables security to increase the quality of what's being deployed in the environment is you can now prioritize preventive controls. Those preventive controls can ensure that no risky infrastructure or code actually makes it into an environment to be compromised. Now, we know that that's not possible to keep everything all the time out, so implement detective controls with reactive or responsive controls. So don't just tell me or detect that there's a problem, and don't just tell me that there's a problem, do something about that problem by building in reactive controls that can go and fix the thing that it just detected that's broken. And ultimately, it's all about automate, automate, automate. If you have to have a person do something, write code so they no longer have to do that thing. In DevSecOps, the only thing a human should be doing is validating what ran and that it checked all of those processes and allowing you to go to the next gate. Since we don't have a whole lot of time left, I'm going to skip some of this. If you aren't familiar with DevOps and the DevOps pipeline, there's plenty of documentation out there that goes through each of the different steps, the AWS services that are available, the partner integrations that we have, as well as the security tools that you can implement into that code pipeline and run right along with the build and deployment steps. Again, we're going to go through this super quick. So in development, speed is critical. In deployment, quality is critical. Inside that development space, you should be giving the static analysis tools and the infrastructure's code scanning tools to your developers. Find options that integrate into the IDE itself. AWS recently announced at reInvent Code Whisperer, which uses generative AI to recommend code and to potentially scan for vulnerabilities in the code as you build it, which is incredibly powerful to ensure that what you commit never gets triggered by a static analysis, which again further drives the speed at which you can deploy into your environments. Once you finish that developer-based code building and deployment, and you're now in your mid stages of doing your build and integration steps, again, run static analysis tools, run your infrastructure's code, checking for any reason that you want to fail that build. Be as thorough as possible, because if you can ensure that the proper hygiene and the proper configurations are in place for both dev, ops, sec, finance are in place, you ensure that what's getting deployed in the last stages meets all of your requirements. The other thing, don't just enforce your guardrails in production. Enforce them in all of your environments at an ever-increasing scale of hard rules. You can start off by just giving people notifications that, hey, just so you know, this is going to fail in your next environment, but don't actually fail it, because maybe you need to do testing. Maybe you need to evaluate something when you're in your dev environment. But as you move up and as you get into your pre-prod and your prod environments, fail. Fail as quickly and as often as you can, so that the quality that you need to operate in a consistent integrity and an available manner is actually available. So ultimately, what is DevSecOps? It's a combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that advance the capacity for frequent realization of business value and adherence to security policy. So ultimately, when you do DevSecOps right, and as security professionals, you enable the developers and the DevOps teams to do what they need to do, you end up helping the business with things going right, and you spend far less of your time dealing with things going wrong, because wrong things don't happen nearly as often when you're focusing on that quality bar and you're using security to help ensure that that quality bar is being met. So thank you for attending this hyper-rapid TED Talk. Any questions in the last minute or two here? And if you want to go into more deeper conversation that was originally intended, let me know. But thank you.